Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for April 2nd, 2024. Many of you noticed that on Friday I did not take questions and I did not do an update yesterday. So I'm going to go into the present situation by looking at one of the questions I frequently get, which is, why is this policy of war and genocide continuing? What's wrong with the NATO leaders and the Western leaders? Don't they realize that they're turning the world against them and destroying the credibility of the so-called advanced sector? So today I'm going to take up the question in regards to the Ukraine war. But I want you to note that I have appended or linked in the description box an excellent editorial getting at that question in depth by my colleague Dennis Small. So make sure you look at that, where he talks about genocide is not accidental, but intentional. Now, looking at the situation in Ukraine makes that clear. There's growing talk in the NATO world from pundits, from military experts, and leaks coming out of defense departments and intelligence agencies that the war is lost. That everyone is quite clear on the fact that Ukraine is on its last legs. The situation has gone over the edge, and it's only a question of time before there would be an acknowledgement of this. The question is, will there be anything left of Ukraine when they finally admit that the attempt to use Ukraine to weaken and destroy Russia has been a failure? There are articles in all the pro-war journals, The Economist, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and so on, that have discussion of when is the time to quit? Is the war lost? You have others like the Atlantic Council and Chatham House, which are continuing to say the war must continue until Russia is defeated. But the problem is they recognize Ukraine is running out of ammunition, and it's running out of men and women to fight. That there's a war weariness in the nations that are supplying Ukraine with money and arms. The perfect example is the U.S. Congress, which has held up completely the supplemental budget of $60 billion plus for Ukraine. And you have the recognition that the escalation, or to escalate, to send more weapons, or to send NATO forces to Ukraine, risks putting us on the edge of nuclear war. So there's panic in the establishment. Now, of course, there are still those who are trying to keep the war going. Let me just review a couple of them. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, remember, he was elected as an anti-war candidate. He said he would implement the Minsk Treaty and would negotiate with Moscow. And in fact, shortly after the special military operation was launched in February 2022, there was a signed agreement between Ukraine and Russia to end the war in the end of March, early April 2022. But NATO intervened. They sent the fool Boris Johnson there to deliver a message: don't quit, we'll give you more weapons and more money. And so the agreement to end the war was scuttled. And Zelensky continues to say that the war must be fought and won. So how many lives could have been saved by negotiation? Going back to 2014, but even going back to March and April 2022, how many lives have been lost because of the willingness of the NATO powers to continue to send wave after wave of Ukrainian men and women at the Russians? Now, then you have the line that comes out from Zelensky and others: if you don't stop Putin here, he's coming after you. It's a foolish lie, because the Russians have no intention to move across Europe, but it's being used to drum up support for expanding war budgets to feed the military-industrial financial complex. You have Macron talking about French troops and NATO troops on the ground. You have talk from the German coalition members, such as Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, Lindner, the economics or finance minister, and others, who are insisting that the war continue. Then you have out-and-out nutcases like retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former commander of U.S. Army Europe. Hodges has been running around, you could say he's singing for his supper, because he's making money now as a talking head and a consultant. And what's he saying? He's saying that NATO is finally recognizing the need to prepare for war, but they're still too worried about what Russia might do. And Hodges said, we must give the Russians something to worry about. And he said that this would prove to the Russians that NATO is committed to the end, and therefore the Russians will back down. Now, slightly more realistic is Dutch Admiral Bauer, who's the present chair of NATO's military committee, who said there's no sign that Russia is gearing up for an attack on NATO. But then he fell back into the narrative. He said Russia's ambitions go beyond Ukraine, and NATO must be prepared. In other words, proceed with the military buildup, more money for the military-industrial financial complex, and along with that, more aspects of a war economy, including censorship and austerity on the population. Then you have Poland's President Tusk, who said, quote, we have to mentally prepare for the arrival of a new era. We are in a pre-war era, unquote. And he called for greater support for Ukraine. Now, this is the line coming from the NATO talking heads, but it's also the line coming from many in the Congress in both parties who insist that the war must continue to be fought. Especially sad is the case of the Democrats, who used to oppose war, but are now gung-ho for fighting these wars and full funding for the military-industrial financial complex. Now, there is an escalation underway against Russia. You have the Crocus Municipal Hall attack with more than 130 killed. And the question of was it Islamic fundamentalists, who is responsible? Ultimately, what the Russians are showing in terms of the money trail is that this was essentially a NATO CIA operation laundered through Ukraine, laundered through so-called Islamic terrorists. But let me ask you this, as Jimmy Dore asked, when was the last time Islamic suicidal terrorists didn't commit suicide, but actually ran away after the fight? So the line coming from the West is a deliberate distortion as they are cheerleading the attacks inside Russia. You also have drones aimed at Russian oil refineries. You have attacks on the Black Sea Fleet as part of attempts to sustain the war effort to convince the taxpayer in the West, keep sending the money. We're doing well. We're killing Russians. Now, one contrary voice is that of Elon Musk, who had a post on X on March 30th, which I think is interesting. He said, any fool could have predicted the failure of the counteroffensive, so why go ahead with it? After the counteroffensive, he said, quote, it was a tragic waste of life, unquote. And then he went on to say, if the war lasts long enough, Odessa will fall too, and Ukraine will lose all access to the Black Sea. And he finished his statement by saying, I recommend a negotiated settlement before that happens, unquote. And of course, there are the voices of international leaders, Pope Francis, the Chinese, and many of the nations of the global South saying, stop this war, stop funding war, get a negotiated settlement. But that's not in the interest of the West. As the futility of using Ukraine to weaken Russia is growing internationally, it may be dawning on Zelensky as well. This last week, he told CBS News that a return to the 1991 borders of Ukraine, which was one of the talking points of Zelensky, he said that's no longer a precondition for negotiations. In other words, he's willing to accept the loss of some territory, but not the regions of the Donbass. So in other words, he intends to continue the war even though he knows the demands he's making for that are unacceptable to the Russians. So the reality is clear. You either end this war in Ukraine through negotiations, or we'll see the end of Ukraine as a nation. Someone should wake up Joe Biden and make that clear to him, and make clear the whole picture. Again, I'm appending in the description section an editorial that's must reading, which goes through the whole history of support for population reduction going back to the time of the American Revolution. These are things that people should know. The informed citizen should not just say they're bad guys that we don't like, but should know what the intent of the policy is and why. And we're providing that to you so that you can use it to educate your friends so that we can end this monstrous policy of the Western establishment of using permanent war and permanent austerity to maintain their power in the world. So thanks for joining me today. I'll see you during the rest of the week.